So, to begin, questions, comments? Yes, sir.
Thank you. If Alexander Hamilton's promulgation of the first bank of the United States is the source, or was the origin of the corruption in politics in America, then why wasn't Andrew Jackson's disbandment of the bank a couple of decades later a cleansing process? In fact, things got much worse, not better. Also, we've had these foreign military adventures and crimes now for many, many decades, since the end of the Second World War. They seem to happen when income tax rates are 90%, and when campaign finance laws are strict, and they happen when income tax rates are down to nothing, and campaign finance laws are lax. So, what's the common denominator then?
Well, I would disagree about the characterization of the Jacksonian era. I think that what we saw under Jackson was a competing coalition of businessmen who had very good, profitable reasons to smash the Bank of the United States. They saw state banks as a very profitable engine. So, we can argue about history. The point about Hamilton was not about the specifics of his financial plan. The point is that Hamilton deliberately set out to create a financial oligarchy. It's very clear. He was very explicit about what he was up to. Madison disagreed. I see that fundamental divide, that fundamental disagreement about the role of finance in politics and money in politics as being really the dominant argument of American history.
Excuse me, Thomas Jefferson wanted the state banks. That was basically his price for agreeing to for the first Bank of the United States. The first depression in the 30s happened because of a collapse of the state banks through, guess what, over speculation in land.
Okay, well, then we could debate the question of banks and politics endlessly. I'm not really sure I see your point. The question of the common denominator between the various crimes of state, depending on whether or not taxes are high or low, or whether campaign finance is rules are lax or severe. I'm not sure that we've ever had a time when campaign finance was particularly tight. The overall point is, I think, difficult to dispute that money is the token of citizenship in our current political system.
Yes, sir. On this side over.
Thank you. I think your discussion now and what permeates the conference, at least today, I wasn't here yesterday, is where does sovereignty reside in the political body? And if the argument that you're making is that there was a transformation into a current plutocracy, then does that imply that sovereignty is mutable? Or is there something transcendental about legitimacy or sovereignty that overarches or encompasses plutocracy, republicanism, and democracy? Where does sovereignty reside?
I don't know that there was a transformation, really. I'm not trying to argue that in the Lost Republic we had true democracy and now we don't. That's certainly not my point, and it's probably clearer in the book. I think that Republican government entails a conflict over who rules and how. And so where does sovereignty lie? Well, you can talk about where sovereignty lies in a constitutional sense, and you can talk about where sovereignty lies in a functional sense. I certainly don't think there's anything transcendental. I don't know if that answers your question.
Over here.
This morning, from my understanding anyway, we learned that the courage to die for what you hold true is maybe a solution to a certain political problems. Now, from your very interesting talk, it seems that there are no solutions, as far as I can see, at all to this morass of lies and mendacity and so forth, which you see in our democracy, so-called democracy. Maybe isn't democracy, is there something wrong? I mean, it's only fair, certainly not in the Founding Fathers. They had no use for democracy. Maybe there's something wrong with democracy itself.
Well, I do think that the democracy was not the term used in the 1790s, right? Everybody talked about republicanism. But the basic point was self-governance, was self-government, whether it was called democracy or republicanism. And certainly there were lots of people in the 1790s who were worried about mass participation and mob rule and so on.
That's the point. I mean, it's not just a difference in which words were used, but the meaning of those words. And the democracy means mob rule, right?
Well, I wouldn't put it that way. I think that democracy, Republican government, representative government, what have you, entails conflict and contestation and rude speech and aggressive political grandstanding. In our system, it entails the competition of interests. The rhetorical stance that I take is, I hope, in the service of refusing to pretend as if we are not living in the middle of a conflict of interests. It is a contest of interest. And the interests that are served in our system are the interests of the extremely wealthy. I argue in my book, and this essay isn't really an argument so much as a reflection on different kinds of lying, that what we should strive for is to be more aggressive in the assertion of our interests. I think that the assertion of interest is the point, the assertion of our material interest. Currently, if you get your news from the New York Times, you could easily lose track of whose interests are being served in our politics. And so I don't think that I'm not arguing that there's something wrong with democracy. I'm arguing that what we need is a more vigorous discourse within our democracy.
Thank you for your presentation, fellow Brooklyn. An attempt to roll back a fundamental right of collective bargaining. And we've seen young people, teachers, firemen, policemen, man the barricades. But there's no mention of that in your conversation this afternoon. On the other hand, we've seen a remarkable rise in the political right-wing extremism found in the Republican Party. And many people have argued that the center of gravity of that party has moved dramatically away from the Eisenhower concept of republicanism to something quite different. We've known for years that there's been a national security state. We've known for years that we have an extraordinarily bloated defense budget. We've known for years that we have an extraordinary global reach, over 1,000 bases. So what's new in what you're telling us? It's Obama's fault. He's a phony. He's a hypocrite. He's a liar. Well, the Democrats are responsible for rolling back and not supporting labor legislation. It'd be hard to convince the 14 Democrats who adjourned their participation and are outside state lines in Wisconsin. So, I mean, you know, we've been around for, I've heard all this during the Vietnam War. Same thing.
So
what's
just
new?
to interrupt, whether or not there's something new here, it's certainly nothing new to talk about Plato and Aristotle endlessly. That's not the point. I'm not bringing you the news. If you want the news, you can go read a website or read the New York Times. My point is to acknowledge what is going on under the current president and to challenge my audience to think about why it is that they are not in the streets the way the people in Wisconsin are. Now, I wrote this before the Wisconsin protests erupted. And so I apologize for not mentioning it. The Wisconsin, the fight over labor rights is obviously at the heart of what I'm talking about here. And the fact that 14 Democrats are doing their very best to prevent the passage of this egregious piece of legislation is not a refutation of the fact that the National Democratic Party has long since ceased to be a strong advocate for labor rights.
Do you think it's doomed? Do you think that the efforts of the 14 state senators in Wisconsin are that it's just a gesture that we can celebrate, but that ultimately they're going to lose?
To tell you the truth, I'm not sure, but I don't think that they're going to win. I think that we're going. It doesn't look like they're going to be successful. It appears that the Republicans are going to get this thing passed, and it's awful. But one might hope that this sort of spark will lead to wider recognition that we can't just sit home and expect the Democrats in Washington to take care of us. That we have to be more assertive, we have to be in the streets, we have to be arguing, we have to be better citizens.
The gentleman over here.
Okay, does this work? Good. I really enjoyed your talk a great deal, and I want to thank you for it. And because I enjoyed it so much, I'm not going to ask you to define democracy. What I will ask you to do, though, is maybe say a bit more about your sense of imperialism. One thing we get from Hannah Arendt's work in The Origins is a sense of imperialism's finer grain, how it thinks, how it dreams, what it wants. And so I guess what I wanted to invite you to do is speculate a bit more about U.S. empire. What is it about U.S. empire that turns mendacity automatically into cruelty, perhaps?
That's a very interesting question. Well, I think U.S. empire is it was born out of the best intentions. I think that the men who theorized the national security state did so out of a fear that the United States would become a garrison state. They felt that the United States must project its power globally, because if the United States were the only democracy surrounded by tyrannies and police states, that we would necessarily become like them, because we would be a fortress and we would become a police state. And ironically, that's what we're becoming. It's a softer kind of cage, but it's a cage. And so the surveillance state, the national security state, that original generation who theorized it, they've passed away, and the people who came after them no longer had those concerns over the dangers of the garrison state. And so I don't know if that really answers your question, but I think American imperialism is curious because it was born out of the desire to preserve the characteristics of American democracy. And as it has experienced pushback and blowback from that global reach, it has systematically betrayed all of those ideals. So I do think it's a tragic. There's a tragic character there.
To get back to your argument that what we need to do is be able to strengthen discourse, I wondered what your thoughts on the rise of the new media, the social media, and the so-called decline of traditional media and perhaps the mass media that Arendt was writing about. Are you hopeful? Do you think that the sort of utopian vision for social media is misplaced? Or
I think the problem with these technologies is that they are double-edged. And so the internet is a glorious medium of communication. We can talk in all these different ways, but it's also, it gives rise to unsurpassed surveillance capabilities. And so the state, they celebrate these uprisings as social media uprisings. I think that's kind of overblown. But as we've seen in Iran, Facebook and other social media sites were used to track down organizers of the uprising there. So I don't think technology fixes anything, really. It enables certain behaviors, but it also enables other behaviors which are less desirable.
In America, for American political wisdom?
I'm sorry, if you could speak to within America.
In the United States, I do think that social media has great potential. I think we're less likely to be persecuted for our seditious comments on the internet. But I don't know that it actually, I have not seen much evidence that it's leading to greater political activism. It would be nice if it would. I'm not particularly optimistic about anything, so if you ask me whether I'm optimistic, no. But I would like to be surprised.
Granted, we shouldn't be happy with status quo politics, as it were. I just sense a lot of, not hatred, but a lot of dislike for Obama, and I was just wondering why all the blame is being placed at his door. Obviously, he's the president, but if you could please elaborate on that. Is there a roadmap to a perfect utopian America in your book, or do you have any kind of suggestions, practical suggestions for pulling out of Afghanistan immediately?
No utopian anything in my book. To answer that part of your question, I think utopian thinking is often the problem. So I don't indulge in that. Whether I have a personal animosity toward Obama, I have no particular personal hatred or my anger toward Obama is not personal. Let me just put it that way. Insofar as I'm angry at Obama, I'm angry about the actions that are carried out in his name. I was no less angry about George W. Bush. I think part of that is a rhetorical persona. I think mealy-mouthed, sort of respectful criticism doesn't get you very far. And so I express myself as vigorously as I possibly can. In terms of how to get out of Afghanistan, we should just simply leave. Just leave. Iraq is more complicated, obviously, because there would be a slaughter.
Hi. So I guess to go back to your point about being a good citizen, there are certain things we can do on our local and state level that is probably more achievable than on our national level. So as a citizen with limited time because of school, work, etc., is it, and maybe you can tell me one way or another, should I be focusing as a local citizen, working on my community boards, working in my community, finding change that's beneficial on that level? Should I be devoting my time looking at national issues, or should I think of myself as a citizen of the world, since we're addressing issues of us being an imperial power and how that can cause harm to us? And I'm only saying this because, and I think in this reality, we only have X amount of time. Time's precious. So maybe you can point me in one direction or the other.
Well, that's a big question. One of the perversities of our system is the cost that is imposed on citizenship. It is very, very expensive to participate in our system of government. People are working harder than ever. Just becoming politically competent in terms of what's happening requires an enormous, all-consuming commitment of time. And I feel like I'm barely politically competent, and that's all I do. So it's very difficult, and I think there are specific things that we can do. And there's one thing that I talk about a lot, which is, because in my argument, I argue that the financing of political campaigns is the single most corrupting element in our system. I think I believe that every public interest organization in the country should devote a large percentage of their budgets toward working toward campaign finance reform of a meaningful kind, because no other reforms can possibly succeed in any significant way as long as Congress is viewed as one of the most lucrative markets you could possibly invest in. And it is extraordinarily lucrative. All advanced businessmen in this country understand that a dollar spent in politics is the best dollar you can ever spend. Just look at the returns. They're extraordinary. So there are, at the national level, it's very difficult. State level, we have seen in Connecticut and Arizona and in 6 other states a certain laboratory experiment with a sort of model system called the clean election system, where I won't get into the details, but it works pretty well. And in Arizona, where all state legislators and the governor all participate, most of the people who've been elected who are now in office in Arizona participated in that system. Now, it's not a panacea. It doesn't fix everything. And you still have right-wingers and left-wingers and everything in between. But it definitely is moving in the right direction. And as it happens, Governor Cuomo is talking about something like that in New York State. So if you ask for what would be a good thing to direct your energies toward, I would say something like that.
We have a gentleman, right here.
I have two questions that are sort of related.
So we can see you.
Oh, okay. I have two questions that are sort of related, and the first is, how do we walk it back? So if the site of discourse as citizens is, if the site of citizenship is the dollar, right, how do we walk it back towards discourse? And then the question that's related to that is, can we discourse with the dollar, right? Is it possible to, that we don't have to walk it back, that things like grassroots make it possible to speak with your money?
Well, in answer to the first question, I think I've partially answered just now in my remarks about the clean election campaign legislation. I think that's a way to walk it in some direction. I don't know if it's walking it back. It's always been the case in our party system that the people who invested in the parties more or less controlled at least the framework within which policy debate took place, even if they didn't dictate specific policies. There was never a particularly golden age, in my view. Now, can you discourse with the dollar? Well, I went to a presentation recently from at the Roosevelt Institute where a guy said, "Look, we're not going to eliminate this money equals speech equation. So we just have to fight money with money, and we have to raise money." And he gave very detailed analysis of 10 congressional districts where Republican stealth money, this new form of undisclosed financial spending, resulted in victories for Republican candidates. And the amount of money flowing through these shadow organizations is stupendous. It is an enormous amount of money, where you have a Democrat who's essentially, a Democrat in a congressional district is essentially running against corporate America. So much money is being funneled in to target specific Democrats. There's no way we can raise, we being people who are appalled by this, not necessarily Democrats. I'm an independent. I'm not a member of either party, so I don't speak as a Democrat. He spoke as a Democrat. He said we have to outspend them before they outspend us. We have to raise this money. But there are only so many George Soroses in the world who are willing to spend this money. Now, there's a lot of money back in the Democratic Party, but the Democratic Party is a center-right party, just like the Republicans. Well, they're not more than center-right. They're just right. And I'm not going to see my interests served by the Democrats, even if they do outgun the Republicans, because the Democrats are serving another wealthy cohort. It's just not the same wealthy cohort. It's two different coalitions of political investors. So if you say, oh, well, let's just help the Democrats outspend, then we get what we have now, which is we're being governed for the benefit of finance, insurance, real estate, media companies, Hollywood, the Democratic industries. The Republican industries are extraction, oil, coal, and so on. It's a different group of businessmen. So I would say it's a losing battle if you try to get into the spending arms race for regular citizens.
Hi, I wanted to just direct that same conversation on a bit more of a global scale, and really just more to hear your thoughts on the topic. It's the discussion of the Fed and their independence from the political arms currently in power. So whether it be Bernanke or Greenspan, and really sort of, depending on your perspective, either the benefits or the damage that's caused by those institutions, and ultimately getting to questions about currency from its valuation standpoint in a global sense, and certainly our battles today with China over that very issue and the impact that it has on every Chinese citizen as well as every American citizen.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think the question of the Fed's political independence is, it's never been all that independent, and it's certainly not now. The current Fed balance sheet, I have in a footnote, $2.5 trillion, of which almost $1 trillion is mortgage-backed securities. The current Fed's funds rate is going back and forth between 0 and 0.25%. That is free money. That is free money. Quantitative easing 2 QE2, $600 billion program of treasury bonds purchasing. They're pumping an enormous amount of money into the economy. Why are they doing this? Because they're trying to maintain this mirage of economic recovery. Now, we all know that the certain sectors of the economy are profitable in, and corporate America has trillions of dollars sitting in these banks. There's a lot of money out there, but the job situation is catastrophic. What the global context is, I think, is I'm getting beyond my area of competency there. I don't really feel comfortable going into that. I think that part of the issue, though, is that what I understand from my reading is that a lot of this is driving the inflation in basic commodities. And so we have this decade-long hunger crisis that's going on all around the world, and I can't give you an explanation for how this works exactly, but my understanding is that part of this food inflation that we're seeing around the world is associated with these easy money policies.
Yeah, may I follow on?
Please.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything you're quoting, and I look at these same statistics as well, and they're appalling. You know, the Fed funds rate is the subsidization of the banking industry, you know, we see that disparity between what people pay on their prime rate and what people are getting at their banking account, and so yes, it does go to fortify your discussion really around how politics are very much sort of driven by business decisions. I guess it's really just more on a more abstract level. Should that be the link? Because there is, you know, the counter argument, the devil's advocate to the Fed's policies is that if it works, you get jobs. Mm-hmm. And ultimately that balance sheet comes down. I'm not saying that this is true, and I'm not advocating it, but I'm saying there's a counter to it.
Sure.
But what is the role of politics in these decisions? And how does it really sort of play into the issues of this conference?
Well, I think that what we have is just as corporate America is focused on quarterly reports and short-term stock market performance, the government is focused on short-term performance. And so short-term economic indicators and all that, it's all about winning that, you know, latest set of numbers with the goal of, you know, getting reelected. And there's always another election. And so the short-term governance, the governance that's directed towards short-term performance prevents us from making the long-term investments that we really need to make. And we can't count on corporate America to do the right thing. They're not doing the right thing now. Taking that, you know, those trillions of dollars of cash balances and putting that toward re-employing people, it's just not happening.
We have time for a couple more questions over here.
I thank you for talking about these things where so many of our news just babbles back the Washington spin, basically, for confidence building. But don't we need greater truth and tolerance, actually, to be able to accept the truth? And I work with the UN mental health groups and interfaith groups. Actually, Mr. Soros did some things here in journalism. The attacks on journalism by governments are even worse than ours. But the idea of, don't we need, I think we brought up the issue of good governance, really, and the issue of national interest, and those issues that we need to be able to discuss more appropriately, and isn't really the issue of the special interests, some of which have money and do rule, but other ones, they're there, but where do we put our faith and hope? And don't we need a more inclusive orientation that leads us towards a more peaceful and successful world of the human potential movement? Isn't that really what democracy is about? What do the words mean? What do the lies mean? That represented a group, the International Society for General Semantics, which talks about the scientific method and the human condition. But isn't that really what democracy is? And isn't what we're really doing is having an overly competitive and adversarial concept of power, supremacy, and control, and that's leaving us in an increasingly, as the Secretary General brought up at the World Economic Forum, which is actually much more liberal than we are, I shouldn't say much more liberal, much more dealing with the realities of life than what we seem to be doing, and just dealing with national sovereignty, and as you brought up, national ego. And is it really leading us, as in Wisconsin, to a more sustainable and healthy life? What didn't the World Economic Forum, which is a big business and economic group, talk about the need, desperate need for new thinking and consciousness, not only on sustainable quality of life and the environmental movement, but everything, really. And I've been promoting the need for to deal with these things at the UN through a good government, holistic, interfaith business, security, and development alliance, which includes a new global financial system, which sounds crazy in this country, but the UN does.
Sorry to cut you off, but I know some other people want to
I'm
ask
sorry, the
questions.
idea of good
So
government.
So what is the question exactly?
Why do we have so much trouble dealing with the issues of good government, and what do the words mean, and why do we just regurgitate back the false gods that we use?
I think I get it. The answer really, I guess, is I suppose human beings are, I think it goes, probably this is not a fashionable term, but human nature is not exactly
what do lies mean? It represented a group, the International Society for General Semantics, which talks about the scientific method and the human condition. But isn't that really what democracy is, and isn't what we're really doing, is having an overly competitive and adversarial concept of power, supremacy, and control, and that's leaving us in an increasingly, as the Secretary General brought up at the World Economic Forum, which is actually much more liberal than we are, I shouldn't say much more liberal, much more dealing with the realities of life than what we seem to be doing, and just dealing with national sovereignty, and as you brought up, national ego. And is it really leading us, as in Wisconsin, to a more sustainable and healthy life? What didn't the World Economic Forum, which is a big business and economic group, talk about the need, desperate need for new thinking and consciousness, not only on sustainable quality of life and the environmental movement, but everything, really. And I've been promoting the need for to deal with these things at the UN through a good government, holistic, interfaith business security and development alliance, which includes a new global financial system, which sounds crazy in this country, but the UN does.
Sorry to cut you off, but I know some other people want to ask
I'm sorry,
questions.
the idea of good
So
government.
So what's the question exactly?
Why do we have so much trouble dealing with the issues of good government, and what do the words mean, and why do we just regurgitate back the false gods that we use?
I think I get it. The answer really, I guess, is I suppose human beings are, I think it goes, probably this is not a fashionable term, but human nature is not exactly non-competitive. I think that as animals we are obsessed with status and with assertion of power, or occupying territory, securing. This is an instinctual animal question. I think. I don't think it can be solved I don't think you can solve this stuff with conferences or with philosophical speculations or conceptual histories. I think that you have to deal with a certain kind of. You have to recognize a certain aggressiveness in the human species and deal with it. And like it or not, we're involved in in politics. We're involved in a system of contestation and competition. And I don't mean free market competition. I mean competition for political power.
Don't we really need excellence, though, higher levels?
Oh, sure. Yeah, definitely, we need it.
Higher levels of achievement. Higher levels of achievement, and isn't exactly what you just said one of our false.
I don't know that it's false. I think it's. I observe it.
No, you're right. But do we really need that dominance to feel self? I mean, I work with the mental health.
I get it.
To be adequate, or issues of self-esteem, and these are issues in education. I just heard Katie Kirk's actually on a very good show talking about education.
It would be
exactly
nice.
these things,
It would be nice if we had more.
But isn't it making us sick, as you point out?
I agree.
One more question?
I have a more factual question. In 2008, how much money was contributed to Obama from kind of average citizens versus corporations or high-end citizens?
It was Obama raised $745 billion. I'm sorry, $1 million. $745 million. Thank you. Of that, 53% was raised through smaller donations.
So that would mean he's actually more.
He
owes more to the average citizen than to the higher.
The problem with that is that small donation, a small contributor has no leverage. A small contributor has no leverage. A small contributor cannot get the president on the phone, cannot get anyone on the phone. You get voicemail. And so that money, by the way, even if he had not received a dime of that, he still would have raised more money than John McCain. John McCain, he raised more than twice as much as John McCain.
You mentioned the labor movement.
The labor movement was a significant contributor. The labor movement's position is, the labor movement as a political investor is captured. See, they have nowhere to go. And it is known to all politicians that you can shaft the labor movement and suffer no consequences. You will suffer no consequences. Obama campaigned, and many people campaigned, on passing the, I can't remember the name of it, the card check legislation, the Employee Free Choice Act. It just disappeared down the memory hole as soon as the election was over. Why? Because what are they going to do? Vote for a Republican?
Sit it out.
Hmm?
Sit it out.
It could happen. Well, that's sort of what happened in the midterms.
I think that's it for now. We'll meet again for our.
Thank you.